Kia ora, Markie here, and the camera is the right way round, which is a bit freaky. That's because Gwendoline has intervened and given me a selfie stick to hold up. So hello, I don't know which episode this is going to be because there's several I've got in mind, and I'm kind of going to be shooting a few today, I think, if I can. So this is going to be one of the last days of the free RJ lockdown program. I want to talk about self-esteem. And Zachary Sucker talks about insecurity, and he says that insecurity is one of the biggies with retroactive jealousy. And his kind of MO with that is to tackle areas where you're insecure by achieving mastery over them. It's not one of my favourite of his ideas, really, because I think that's kind of looking at things from the outside in rather than from the inside out. And I think you can fail at mastery of things. You can try and achieve mastery of things, and you can fail with that, really. So I think a better way is to look at insecurity from the inside, and that's the work of that is a lot to do with attachment, which we've talked about. Therapy is very long-term therapy, particularly, is the key to that one, really. But self-esteem is closely related, so I want to talk about self-esteem. I've got Gwendoline with me, not just in a technical capacity, but in a clinical capacity. So I thought today, we're coming to the end, so I thought I'd give you two psychotherapists for the price of one. And we just give our input on self-esteem, really. So, how do you build self-esteem? I kind of look at self-esteem in quite an interesting way, because self-esteem can be kind of conditional and unconditional. A lot of us are, self-esteem is only as good as the last thing we've done. So our self-esteem can kind of go up and down all the time. I like to think that to really have sustainable self-esteem, you need to kind of have a reserve tank. You need to kind of have a degree of unconditional self-esteem. So I guess self-esteem is gonna come and go depending on if you feel like you've failed at something, if you feel like you've not kind of done very well, if you've not had a good week or whatever, then your self-esteem might be a little bit lower. But I like to think that ideally it's not that fickle. It's something that actually you can have, like I said, a little way I look at it, like a reserve tank. Unconditional self-esteem, where even if you're not doing great, things haven't gone so well, you've had some, things haven't been successful, maybe you've done some things that you feel bad about, that doesn't leave your tank empty, that doesn't leave you kind of with zero self-esteem, really. So that's one of the things that I look at with self-esteem. So I think one of the things you can do is, I think a good exercise is write down, not necessarily all the things that you're brilliant at, or that you include that in the list, but all the things that you're good enough at. That's quite a good exercise, so a good enough list. Because often we take things for granted, So for example, learning to drive isn't always that easy. So if you drive a car, that'll be something you put on a list. So that's an exercise I would recommend. I'm going to bring in Gwendoline. What are your?
Kia ora, everyone. My thoughts.
Kind of
yeah.
Thoughts? How would you go about working with, supporting somebody with low, so not in a therapeutic way, but if somebody was, as in not somebody that's a psychotherapy client.
Okay.
But how would you, what would you recommend for somebody that's wanting to build their self-esteem?
Okay, so I think I'm in agreement with you in terms of Zachary's idea. Although I've got great respect for his work and everything, I think that idea is a bit flawed because. Yeah, exactly for the reasons that Markie has outlined, I think. So, yeah, my take on this is very biased towards psychotherapy, really. And I think in a way that is the work of psychotherapy, in that ultimately, you gain, yes, there is a sense of mastery, but that comes through, it comes relationally, that comes from really mastering how to have a good enough relationship in some respects. That is one way that we kind of become content with ourselves and able to do the things that we absolutely must do in order to replicate that in other relationships. For example, setting boundaries with people. If you're kind of a doormat, if that's you don't know how to say no to people, for example, those things are going to make you ultimately feel bad about yourself, and then that pattern continues, and you will attract more people to you that are going to do the same thing because you don't know how to look after yourself in that regard. So that perpetuates the cycle of not feeling like you're good enough, really, even though it's not true.
I've often thought about assertiveness as being like the protective mechanism for growing self-esteem. I always think of it like, when you have a seedling, you have a little plant, and you have you have a little kind of stick next to it to keep it upright.
Yeah.
I always think that assertiveness is that stick, and the little seedling is the self-esteem. Because if you improve your boundaries so you're not the doormat, then your self-esteem can grow. But if you don't, then it's like the seedling is just going to get battered all the time. It's going to start to grow, and then a wind's going to come along and knock it over. Yeah. So the two so assertiveness is, like say, kind of boundaries, not being a doormat, kind of all those kind of that's a very good way to nurture self-esteem.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily give you self-esteem, but it kind of protects self-esteem while it's delicate and it's growing.
Oh, definitely. I think that's definitely an essential factor. I think where people sometimes trip up with these kinds of words like assertive or even resilient is that it sounds as though that you... I don't know, it's almost a kind of refutation of vulnerability and the kind of true foundation. Because I could, you see girls do this sometimes, don't you? I don't care, and it's like, oh my gosh, she's so confident, she's so sure of herself. Well, actually, she'll go home and cry, So she might appear to be assertive and knows her stuff, but true assertive, true confidence is not necessarily loud. And that kind of I think
I use assertiveness in a very textbut way, because I used to teach it, and not in necessarily the connotations that it might have of being brash or anything like that, really. For me, assertiveness, so you've got aggression on one extreme and being passive on the other, and it's that point that's in the middle. So for me, assertiveness is very much about being real, being vulnerable.
Yes.
So assertiveness is a very honest.
Yes, there's an authenticity to
thing.
it.
It's it's not an act.
I think, I guess that little caveat I added is kind of in the same way that, anger management training, yes, that's all good and well to say, okay, count to 10 and don't punch the person or whatever. But the thing is, it would be more potent to actually understand the root of your anger and to understand how to use it, how to really master it, quote unquote master it, So I guess that's all I meant, really. So that it's from it coming from a real place, but But
I think therapy does it gets to the core of all these kind of things, really. But I suppose I'm thinking kind of DIY.
Yes, of course.
DIY self-esteem. What can you do this week? While you've got we've got this lockdown on, that could be so I think that good enough list is a good way around it. I think definitely. I'm glad you mentioned assertiveness, because that's very useful. It's a good thing to read up on. I think I will do a video on it at some point, because assertiveness isn't what you think it is. There's a very definite kind of theory around assertiveness, and there's very clear models. So that's something we'll do at some point. Probably not as part of this series. What about self-talk?
You mean as in negative and positive self-talk, that kind of thing?
Because that's a biggie, isn't it?
Definitely. I think if we're talking about kind of self-help here, one of the things that I found years ago before I trained as a therapist, and I'll try and remember who to give credit to here, but I found really useful, I think, was around the work of possibly Clarissa Pinkola Estes.
Women Who Run with Wolves?
Yes, that she's the author of that book, Women Who Run with Wolves. So that would be a good place to think. And also there were other thinkers and speakers, and even Marianne Williamson. So I guess for me, one of the things that I learned early on was around I'm trying to think how to say it, but yes, just how, if you've grown up in an environment where you've been spoken down to, maybe you've been hit physically, or, you've been treated with not very tender hands by whoever was supposed to look after you, that the idea is that gets introjected, like you basically take that into yourself.
Yeah, definitely.
And it becomes like a script. These things get coded, and so you continue to say those things to yourself, even without realizing it as you get older. So I think, yes, that's a powerful thing to understand, and then to dismantle that, I think positive affirmations can be useful. So Louise Hay would be someone you could look up. But again, therapy can be the most kind of groundbreaking and permanent way to dismantle this stuff. And I'm not saying, everyone just has to have therapy, but that's just my bias, really, and that's what I've seen to be true, to be lasting. But yeah, those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah. So yeah, with self-talk, the first thing with self-talk is you've got to identify it. You've got to notice, because these thoughts, like you say, they become automatic. We don't notice them.
Yes, it's like a post-hypnotic suggestion.
Yeah. So this is another area where mindfulness is useful, because if you become mindful, you start to notice these kind of thoughts that before just kind of whiz through your head without you even paying attention to them, and then you can start to challenge them. And you have to be very careful as well. There's kind of like, you can beat yourself up verbally, mentally and verbally. And then what people often do when they recognise that they're doing that is they kind of meta beat themselves up. They recognise that they're beating themselves up and then beat themselves up for beating themselves up. So I always use the analogy of if you've got a child and they're learning to walk, and they fall down, what would you do? I'd like to think that you wouldn't kind of beat the crap out of them. I'd like to think that you actually be quite gentle and quite supportive and come on, try again. So I think you have to kind of treat yourself in the way that you would treat a child, in that very gentle way, with a bit of humour, that you notice that you're beating yourself up and saying things you don't want to be saying, but gently correct yourself and put yourself back on course. Don't get out of that habit of being harsh with yourself. Any final thoughts? Yeah,
that's a really good point about that pattern that can happen. Just be mindful. I would add, just to add to what Markie said, really important and helpful, that can become a new cycle. And sometimes I think we need to examine the things that we're really attached to, the patterns that we're attached to. Sometimes those patterns are really self-destructive, and things like beating yourself up, and you've maybe think, okay, well, I've understood now that my mother always talked down to me, and she was always really vicious, her tongue was really sharp and everything, and I'm trying not to do that to myself. But then you're like, oh, but I'm so stupid and I effed up, blah blah, and there you go back into it in a different form. And actually there can be something that is kind of familiar about it, that is almost comforting. It's possible that your security was in that insecurity. So this is something that I think is a huge challenge for anyone who's had difficulties in their early life, that you can become hooked to the things that are actually really harmful to you, and it's hard to break that cycle. So I would just add to that. Sorry, my eyes are watering, guys, because it's windy.
Passionate and crying.
Really passionate. I'm crying with passion.
Yeah, I think really the first thing about sort of it's like if somebody's drowning. That joke, isn't it? If somebody's drowning, what's the first thing you do? You take your foot off their head. So, a bit of black humour, really. But if your self-esteem is low, the first thing you've got to do is stop damaging it even more, really, before you can even begin to build it up again. Because if you're still doing the damage to yourself by your internal processes, you're making yourself, actively making your self-esteem worse, really. So there's loads of ways to approach this. So what were those two references? What was it?
Clarissa Pinkola Estes.
And what was the other one?
Louise Hay is another one.
Louise Hay, and did you say somebody else?
Marianne Williamson. Some of her earlier work.
Okay.
Maybe.
So they're all I'm familiar with Louise Hay. I'm not familiar with the other two. So so check out those. So we mentioned books before. There's a couple more authors for you to check out. So I'm familiar with the book Women That Run With Wars, but I've never read it.
Right. It's very big.
Check out those three authors. So okay. We're losing our battery now, so we probably better say goodbye. We're on our little daily constitutional, about to head back to the ranch, and we'll see you soon.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Rangimarie.